Funding for Colores was provided in part by Frederick Hammersley Foundation and viewers like you. This time on Colores, a special 3-part Veterans Day program devoted to helping veterans heal from traumatic brain injury.
Tremendous burden of these brain changes.
Bill Shuttleworth and David Quinn of UNM's Innovative Center for Brain Recovery and Repair share remarkable discoveries in understanding brain trauma. Suffering from PTSD, veteran James Eby uses mask making to heal.
How do you feel about yourself?
And art therapist Dana Tisconia Simmons and James Eby discuss connections between brain research and art therapy to find breakthroughs in healing. It's all ahead on Colores.
Bill, in some cases, veterans are dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. What happens to a brain that's injured?
So there are injuries that we can see, traumatic brain injuries that are maybe a penetrating injury or something like that, where there's obviously a physical injury. There's quite a lot of work that's gone on recently that is able to define a lot of the processes that get triggered by that. But more common are injuries you can't see. And with PTSD and other trauma-related issues, the brain might, the head, the individual might look outwardly quite normal, like there's nothing at all that might be wrong. But unfortunately, there's really a lot of fine detail of the fine wiring of the brain that's disrupted that you can't see. So it's invisible, yet the impact on quality of life is tremendous.
When you look at the scope of this, why are you committed to this work?
Well, I'm a neuroscientist, so I study how the brain works, individual brain cells, how they talk to each other, and how they might underlie some of these disorders. So what I'm most passionate about with PTSD and disorders like that is to try and support the idea that this is just like any other consequence of trauma or injury that a warfighter might face. So to destigmatize in a way from a brain perspective. So I really care about people understanding what's between their ears, and when somebody says that this is all in your head, I think that's a fantastic point. These really devastating issues are completely within your head, and they're completely real. When someone says it's just in your head, often that's stigmatized. You shouldn't worry about that, you should go and toughen up and get through that. But from a neuroscience perspective, you can actually see real disruptions to the real biology of the brain that should be taken just as seriously as a broken arm or anything else. That's what I'm really passionate about.
Do these symptoms have a significant impact on people's lives?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's something that Davin sees every day. When we talk to veterans that are suffering from PTSD, even as neuroscientists, we're hearing about the really tremendous burden of these brain changes on social isolation, on the inability to live normal lives or lives that they want in ways that are extremely distressing. So yeah, absolutely real.
Bill mentioned that you see some of the impacts that people are dealing with from these injuries. What does that look like?
It's a very, very tragic picture, particularly for veterans where if you experience a blast, a military traumatic brain injury, there's so many different things that can happen to you. It's called polytrauma, in fact, because to allude to the fact that different things happen to you. There can be a physical injury to your body that causes pain. There can be a neurological injury to your brain that causes its function and performance to be impaired. And then there's a psychological injury from being in a situation where you almost died. And so the combination of those three factors, the pain, the neurological, and the psychological injuries, is almost impossible to bear for some people. And so I have a great deal of empathy and sympathy for our veterans who have experienced that.
How is this more novel approach to therapy effective?
Well, what we're doing in our lab is once we get neuroimaging that tells us how are the different parts of the brain performing, particularly the parts that regulate and organize all the other information that comes into it. Once we have an idea of how that area is performing and where it's actually occurring or failing, we then direct gentle electrical currents to that part of the brain just by placing electrodes on each person's scalp. And we're able to, at an individual level, at a personalized level, deliver gentle electricity to that part of the brain to actually improve its performance. So to take the parts of the brain that are underperforming and actually try to help them do the job that they're trying to do.
How is your research helping to alleviate the problems with TBI cases?
So traumatic brain injury can cause many different problems. One of the problems that we think is overarching, that leads to several different things down the road, is that the network of brain areas that regulate and organize is not able to do its job. And so every other system is affected by that. Your hearing, your vision, your balance, your memory and attention. And so what we want to do is we want to try to rehabilitate that organizing, overarching network so that it can do a better job of making sense of the information that's coming into the brain from the outside world. And so that way we can actually try to affect multiple domains at once by addressing that overarching network.
So is the electrical stimulation actually, is it creating new pathways in the brain? Is that what it's doing?
Well, Bill can probably tell you what's happening at the very sort of molecular synaptic level with that. His research really sort of studies how we can improve neuroplasticity by using or affecting kind of the electrical activity of the brain.
So a lot of folks, me included, a long time ago thought the brain is pretty static. By the time we get to our age, everything is set. But it's not. The brain actually changes a lot all the time. And that's one of the most fascinating things about understanding how things like PTSD come to become set in the brain, but also how we can unwire them, unpack them, and build new pathways. So plasticity just refers to the idea that you can change the function, the structure and the function of the brain. I think when we talk to vets, we get quite excited about showing them what the individual pieces of the brain are. They're these tiny little, analogous to computers, tiny little cells, computers in the brain that are of enormous number. There's about 100 million of these. And these all have tens of thousands of connections on average to other cells. So all of these computers are, it's like a very, very intricate system with millions and billions of switches doing these functions. So when the point is these are all electrical. These are all electrical connections between these. So switches is a good analogy. So when Davin in his studies is applying weak electrical currents, he's changing the ratio of these switches being on and off, just gently, just tweaking it a little bit, so that actually whenever we're having this conversation, we're doing that. We're actually making connections change in our brains. And when you're trying to change the brain to improve outcome from PTSD, you can help it along with a little bit of electrical current so that what you're trying to do occurs a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to flip those switches to build those new pathways. So the combination of weak electrical currents with other cognitive therapies or behavioral therapies or even art therapies are really interesting ways to boost the plasticity of the brain and accelerate recovery.
How do you feel art therapy such as mask making and brain stimulation help in brain recovery and repair?
When you have a TBI, when you have the polytrauma from a mild traumatic brain injury, it alters your life radically in so many different ways. It's almost impossible to be the person that you were before you had the head injury. And that loss of your sense of who you are, the loss of all the things that you did in your life that gave it meaning, is a really devastating loss. And art therapy is an incredible way of actually finding meaning in what happened to you. And so the masks that I've seen have been these incredible statements of sort of, this is what my life was about, this is what my life is about now, and this is what I want my life to be about. And it helps veterans to organize and come up with a way of thinking about what happened to them. Brain stimulation can't really compete with that. It's not able to do that. But what it can do is to make some of those things that you are having trouble doing easier to do. And so by combining those two things, art therapy restoring meaning and brain stimulation restoring capability, we're actually able to do a better job of healing the whole person.
And Bill, how does the act of drawing actually help in this process?
Well, I'd echo Davin's comments there. I think this is it's a really powerful way of rewiring the brain in a way that's very positive, in a way that it can't be done with other types of, it can't be done with surgery, or it can't be done with medicines. And that again comes back to my orientation, thinking about the problem as a problem of these billions of little switches. These are tiny little switches. A scalpel is way too big. A neurosurgeon, they do magnificent things for big brain injuries, but for making these repairs and building these new pathways, they're too small for a scalpel to work. They're too distributed for medicines to work. Medicines are very important for helping folks get where they need to be to start some therapy, but they're not going to be able to build new circuits. And art therapy and other types of behavioral therapies that go in and build new pathways in a very sort of structured and supportive way can build workarounds to the detrimental pathways that have been established by trauma. So I find that as a neuroscientist, it's a thrilling way to see the real efficacy when you do brain imaging after some of these therapies and see the structure and the function of the brain change before and after this. That to me is really powerful to a veteran who may actually be quite skeptical that doing something like this is going to change their brain. It does. It really changes your brain in a way that nothing else can.
And if I can piggyback on what Bill was saying, the power of an activity like drawing is also that it takes us into a nonverbal, more visual realm.
Right, gets us out of here.
Exactly. We're so used to living in a verbal world where everything is based on words and concepts and numbers. And getting out of that, stepping out of that is actually something that we don't do that often, unless you're an artist or an architect or a musician. And so going into the nonverbal realm with these activities, with these rehabilitation activities, actually is more powerful, I think, because it engages these parts of the brain that we're not often engaging enough.
Why is this work so important?
Well, traumatic brain injury and PTSD are only becoming more prevalent. We see that in our service members who are coming home from modern conflicts, the type of conflicts that we engage in, the type of weapons that are used. We actually have very, very good treatments now to keep people alive. But what it means now is that they're alive, but they're living with their injuries. And so we need to do a better job of addressing these injuries that happen in these modern conflicts, because that's really what is affecting our service members when they come home. It's often the neurological and the psychological injuries that really get in the way of plugging back into society.
I think these are absolutely devastating disorders, and destigmatizing is absolutely critical. There are so many folks walking around feeling as though there's nothing that can be done. There is. And that step through the door into a different type of counseling or therapy is so important, and it can save lives.
Well, art therapy is a brain-based intervention to help in the healing of trauma. So it actually activates all different areas of your brain when you're making art. If there's anything that you really want to talk about while you're doing this, or if you notice things coming up, we can talk about that while you work too.
Most of the time when I'm doing any of my art or I'm creating something, if I'm making a knife handle or something, I go with darker colors. Mm-hmm. I feel like the green is just something I don't usually go towards. Mm-hmm. And brown, I'm usually not a brown person, just something.
Yeah.
It's not something that's attractive to me, but it works, so. Oh.
I tend to notice that when I'm working with vets, a lot of times greens and browns are used.
Camouflage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of times art can be a way, a bridge to access those wounds that we have inside of us and be able to access the unconscious. What are you noticing?
If I'm having some sort of issue, if I'm not being able to cope well in a situation, I just either shut down and don't say what I should, or I just don't say anything. I just kind of close off.
I noticed the lock up there.
Yeah, because I don't know. I think, I think that would probably represent, like, I keep everybody out of my head. Try to make sure that nobody can get in and probably, again, a defense mechanism, mess with my head, basically. So I kind of keep it locked out so nobody else can get in.
And do you feel like your head was messed with before?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, just relationships and different things, how I was manipulated, and maybe it wasn't the other person's intention, but it happened. And I feel like it was a place of weakness for me.
Yeah.
And that's probably why everybody's locked out now, is just because I don't want to feel weak again. I don't want to be manipulated again. I'll discuss what's going well. I'll discuss business. I'll discuss personal triumphs, different things like that. But anything else, I don't talk about it. So the lock, basically no one can hurt me if they can't get in. And if my mind's locked, it's safe and secure. The stitches is, the more I share, the more it hurts. And then if they can't use it against me if they don't know, or if I don't tell them.
Right.
So it all comes to the same thing.
And I'm curious how you feel about yourself. Do you have self-love?
Yeah. In some cases, almost too much. I can be self-centered and selfish. I mean, that we're humans. It's what we are.
Right.
That's just kind of our nature. But and then other times I just nothing.
But then again, the word selfish and love, they don't really mean the same thing, do
Right.
they?
No, not at all.
And anything that we want more of, when we're able to give more of that, it helps us receive more in our life.
Yeah, and that's something that I have a hard time with.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm just one of those persons that doesn't believe in instant results.
Well, and processes like this sometimes take time to unfold.
How does art therapy and the science of neurobiology work together to address healing?
Well, the way the brain works is very interesting, especially with art therapy, because art therapy is a way that bypasses all the language centers of the brain. Trauma gets stuck with certain senses like smell and hearing and sight, and visual language cannot always address where those traumas are stuck at. But using different creative arts, you're able to actually get in there, and where the trauma is stuck at in the brain, the art can help kind of bring that memory up to the surface. And the more that you're able to get that out in front of you, it's like you're helping to release that trauma that's been held in there. And even with blasts, it's like there's that shock wave that comes through, right? Words are not going to be able to heal that. But being able to maybe get into some clay or draw or whatever, it's like you're really kind of bringing all the implicit stuff outside and making it explicit.
By doing that, are you then you're literally like creating new neural pathways?
Yeah, anytime you're learning a new skill, you're creating new neural pathways. And anytime it helps with the neuroplasticity of the brain, just being able to get in there and do something new and explore and then learn a new skill.
James, can you talk a little bit about how you were being affected by your experience in combat?
So I've been affected a few different ways. I mean, I was a gunner for a convoy security team in Iraq, so when I see trash and different debris on the side of the road, sometimes that can trigger it, and I'll make erratic lane changes and different things like that, and my family freaks out and they're like, what are you doing? But I think that just kind of goes with the territory. Other than that, different sense.
Different sense, different smell?
Yeah, if I smell something, it can trigger a flashback. Sleep, I don't know why, but there are times at sleep where I just have a vivid image of being back in combat or being in one of those stressful situations and then wake up in a cold sweat.
What is that like emotionally when that comes out of nowhere? And
I personally don't like remembering some of those things. I don't like hashing up some stuff that's happened in my past, especially anything that was traumatic. It's just not something that's pleasant that I'd want to dwell on. And so it actually sets the tone for my day. So if I have a night terror, if I have something that triggers, it can either be a good trigger or a bad trigger, and it can mean a good day or a bad day.
what kind of coping mechanisms do you have to deal with that? To sort of center yourself?
Most of the time, if I'm having a bad day, first thing I'll do is I'll either actually dip out of work a little early, maybe take an hour off early, or as soon as I get home from work, and I'll go straight out in my shop and start building either a knife. I'm a bladesmith, or lately I've been working in carpentry, so building something else that's constructive and something new to me, and that's been helping out with coping. Just because if I'm not doing something active, I'm going to be toxic to somebody else because I had a bad day. So I try to focus on creating rather than being destructive.
And Dana, how do you gain insight into experiences that could be worked through with the mask?
Art therapy has what they call the ETC continuum. So it's like an expressive continuum that correlates kind of with the brain. And we go for, there's like sensory, there's symbolic, there's perceptual, there's kinesthetic. And so you kind of see like what they're moving through. And we would just go deeper into that and explore what those images really mean to them. And on James's piece, he ended up putting a lock right up here on his forehead. And so I would ask him to explain to me like what that actually meant for him.
James, could you share any of the discoveries from the mask workshop that you did with Dana?
There was just a couple of things that came out, and while I was designing my mask, it came out like the lock, and that represented me basically locking anybody out, not being able to get in my head, not being able to be vulnerable. And then there was also a light bulb, and that was like when I'm having, I feel cloudy at times, and then sometimes this light bulb will just pop on and I'll have an explosion of clarity or creativeness, or I'll just be able to grasp whatever concept is being thrown at me at the time, where other times it's just kind of hazy and weird.
Was it helpful to talk through like a actual representation you're looking at?
I think so, yeah, just because I may recognize what's going on, but I won't admit it. But then when it's physically there in front of you, you can't deny that it's there. And you have somebody helping you walk through and accept what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I think acceptance is a big part of it, and it just helps open you up to new possibilities of help, mm-hmm. fixing yourself, and better health in general.
Can you trace this to an experience that you know affected you?
I could trace it to a few experiences. I know I saw action in different things when I was in Iraq, especially. I think back to one of the most traumatic times for me. We were on base weren't out on a convoy, weren't getting shot at or anything, and then our alarms start going off that we're getting mortared. And rule of thumb is if you can hear it whistle, you're probably gonna get hit. And exited my tent. I was headed out to a bunker, which is just a concrete, enclosure that's supposed to keep you safe. And heard a whistle, and I was there with two of my friends, and I tucked up against a HESCO barrier, which is just a burlap basket basically filled with sand. And the mortar hit the other side of the barrier from me. And so it was a shock, it was a blast. I was concussed, I had some issues. And that was something that after that, I could tell there was some sort of change with my mentality and how I looked at things. I had a different look on life. And so at times it's a good thing. And I look back at like, hey, that's when things change, and that's when, life can end at any time. And so you have to, appreciate what you have. And at other times it's like, holy crap, somebody was really trying to kill me, and it's still hard to process. So depending on how I look at it and what triggers that memory or whatnot, it makes the experience of that memory different.
Why is mask making particularly good for veterans?
It just really helps them, like James said, it's like you see it in front of you, you cannot deny it. It's like it's right there.
I think that's really true. I mean, until it's right there in front of you, until it's in black and white, or in this case, random colors, it's hard for a lot of us veterans to accept what's going through our heads, what we're experiencing. And we'll push it out, and the military trains us to be tough, to not show emotion, and to deal with it at a later time. And the mask making is that later time for a lot of us.
To view this and other Colores programs, go to newmexicopbs.org and look for Colores under local productions. Also, look for us on Facebook and Instagram. Until next week, thank you for watching. Funding for Colores was provided in part by Frederick Hammersley Foundation and viewers like you.